Okay, so let's take a look at the adrenal gland. So for the adrenal gland, I'm going to make a new layer. And we'll call this adrenal detail. And when we make this, it's not going to have the same. Whoops, let's reduce the brush size here. It's not going to have the same mask. So make sure we're on the paintbrush. No stamp. Sorry, I'm just trying to demonstrate the. So you can see that we can paint anywhere. But if we right-click on the mask and choose Duplicate Selected, we can duplicate that mask and apply it to the adrenal detail layer. Just make sure we drag it right onto the layer. So now that we've got the mask applied, you can see that any drawing that we do on the adrenal gland is only going to be applied to that area. So that's the benefit of being able to duplicate that mask over. Okay, so make sure that we've got the adrenal detail layer selected and not the mask. And so we're going to be painting on this. And I thought we could have some blood vessels on here, but it's going to be a little bit of a pain to sort of paint individual blood vessels. I kind of want this dense network of vessels on here, whether or not that's realistic. So what I want to do is I'm going to choose a stencil again. But there's nothing in here that really reminds me of blood vessels. So I actually took just a little bit of time and kind of created my own. Okay, so I'm going to go into the image browser, close the color picker for now, and I'm going to navigate to my class project and get into the textures folder. And I painted this blood vessel stencil. So I painted this, I painted this in Photoshop quite quickly. And it's not, it's not fantastic, but it's somewhat representative of blood vessels. And so what we can do is with this little icon here, send as a stencil, we want to make sure that we've got our paintbrush selected, and we click this little icon here that says use as stencil or set stencil. And now if we go back to the 3D view, you can see that that stencil is showing up over a viewport. So again, with the S key, we can kind of change the scale of that, position that appropriately, maybe rotate it a little bit. And then with my paintbrush and a nice bright, rich red color, although again, not completely saturated, maybe a little bit back here somewhere, we can just paint over that. And now we're just going to be painting those blood vessels on here. So maybe I want to use a bit of a softer fall off, something like that. And we can just paint some of those blood vessels in. And if we move this around, we can kind of reposition that stencil and paint some more in. Let's just go nuts and paint some blood vessels all around here. This is probably wildly inaccurate, but again, you get the idea. This is just much, much faster than painting them by hand, I think you'll agree. So you could do this with any kind of, you could generate a liver texture. So here I'm working with just a black and white stencil, but if you had a gray, if you had any gray values, then that would allow the paint to partially come through. So you could have some kind of fall off in your stencil if you're having adding some kind of texture of some kind. So white would allow 100% of the paint to come through, black allows 0% of the paint to come through, and then white would, or some values of gray would allow intermediate values. Yeah. Okay, so there we go. We got a billion blood vessels there on our adrenal gland. The other thing that we might want to do, and I probably should have done this first now that I'm painting on this, is I'm going to hit, go into the stencil and turn that off by clicking the off button under the stencil. And I'm going to try using the dry brush. And what the dry brush is going to do, there's not a whole lot of detail here, so it's not going to work supremely well. But you can see by this icon that the dry brush is going to paint only the erased areas. So maybe we want to create this kind of brownish sort of light value here and sort of paint over that. Obviously we're going to be going over top of our blood vessel layer here. So we can make a new layer, or we can kind of just kind of go over top of it. And if we hold the control key, and maybe I'll choose a darker color, if we hold the control key, that's only going to be painting in the sort of recessed areas. So that's kind of the opposite of the dry brush. And so again, I should have done these steps in reverse, because we want the blood vessels to sort of sit over top of it. But this way we could kind of paint in the cracks and crevices, this darker value, and then maybe in the lighter value could kind of get sort of an area over top. When we were sculpting, the shift tool smoothed out the geometry, and in a similar way, the shift tool chooses this blur tool. So if we hold the shift while we're painting, that's going to blur stuff out. So that's probably way too strong. So if we want to reduce that, we can go into the blur tool, set the blur strength down to something like 5 or 10. And then now when we're painting and we want to sort of blur, sort of smudge out some areas, we can kind of use the shift tool. It's a lot less useful than the smooth tool is when sculpting, but it could be good for some kind of smooth blending of your color. So just to be aware of that. When you save a Mudbox painting file, it's going to save the main file .mud.mud, but it's also going to save an associated, I think, at least on a PC it does, I think it does on a Mac, it's going to save this associated folder of files, and it's going to have image previews as TIFF files. And I suspect, I don't know exactly how that all works, but I think that's a proxy or an intermediate sort of storage format before you actually export the Ptex images. But just as a point of interest, this is what a Ptex mask, or this is what the Ptex file looks like. It's just a bunch of differently sized squares. So you can see how really difficult it would be to paint in Photoshop. It's not going to give you, let's see if I can find the one of these kidney detailed ones. There's no way you could paint that in Photoshop and make sense of what that was actually going to look like on your model. So that's why you have to paint in 3D, in a 3D application like Mudbox. Okay. So let's continue on with the uritor. Let's create a new layer called uritor detail. And we're going to duplicate the uritor mask here and drag and drop it onto the new layer. So you can see it's kind of preparing the texture, and it might just take a little bit to sort of refresh. So let's make sure we got a uritor layer selected. And I don't want to do too much with this. I mean, we could kind of go nuts with the sort of the blending and the painting and all of this, but let's just choose a kind of blotchy stamp and kind of with a lower value sort of paint in there. And if at any time we want to come back and see how the lighting is sort of affecting it, we can turn the flat lighting back on, or off rather. Turn the flat lighting off, and then we can see how the lighting is influencing and our textures a little bit more. The other way you can pick colors is just by holding I. If you hold I, you'll get the eyedropper tool, and you can kind of sample that from the object. And with the eyedropper tool, you can see that you've got a couple of options. You can either sample the current layer or sample all the layers, like you can do in Photoshop as well. So if you wanted to sort of pick a color like that and sort of blend that area in a little bit, you can kind of sample something that's close here and sort of blend it. Maybe the uritor, I'm going to turn off randomize and use this longitudinal sort of stamp image and create this kind of streaky texture, which probably isn't realistic, but that might sort of represent this kind of long tube structure. Okay, so I'm happy with the color of this, or at least we're finished with that for the time being. So we could collapse this all up, and we could even collapse the group. And we can say we're done with the diffuse painting. So the next thing we want to paint is a specular channel. So like we did with the leaf, we're going to determine which areas of this are going to be shiny and which areas are going to be less shiny. Now, if I look at this model, it looks like it all has this really kind of wet texture. So maybe it would be appropriate to have all of this as kind of this quite a shiny area. But maybe I want, for example, the kidney itself to be a little bit more matte, since it's a bit more of a sort of a grainy texture and a little bit more diffuse. And maybe I want the adrenal gland to really be quite shiny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer. And I'm going to call this kidney speck. And instead of the diffuse channel, I'm going to choose the specular channel. And so we're going to be painting specular information. And so you can see that that creates a new group underneath diffuse, and it creates a new layer for us there. Now, the way that the material, like the default shader for Mudbox, doesn't necessarily influence how your shader is going to be set up in Maya. So for example, even though this is kind of has a little bit of shininess to it, that doesn't necessarily mean that when you export these textures into Maya, you're going to have the same effect, because you could set up a really, really reflective, glossy shader in Maya, or you could set up a really, really matte shader in Maya. And so in order to kind of approximate what we might want, we can change some of the material presets in this tab down at the bottom. So if we choose material presets, we can just cycle through these, and hopefully these are going to be, hopefully they're going to show up. There we go, we get a little bit of information there. So some of these have really tight specular highlights, like this one here, that makes it look really almost wet, and others are going to be really flat. So this isn't, choosing these presets, this is not influencing our textures in any way. It's just influencing how the light is being interacting with the surface. So maybe if we're painting diffuse information, it would be nice to choose one of these gray flat material presets, just as a temporary preview of what this might look like when it's rendered. But for a wet texture, maybe I want to start out with this default shiny material. And so I can at least get a sense of what a shiny material would look like. So with this kidney specular, again, we're going to be painting in grayscale, right? So the specular map is going to be arranged from black to white. So I'm going to start out with a mid-level gray, maybe something 50% gray, and I'm going to turn off my stamp image, and I'm going to flood the paint layer. And when I did that, you might notice that the specular highlights got dimmed a little bit. And so I could do that again. I could turn this just right down dark gray and flood the paint layer, and you can see that these highlights have dimmed quite a lot. And so this is influencing the fact that the whole model has become less shiny. So we could go in and we could get the white, or maybe a very light value, maybe not pure white. And we could paint over top of the adrenal gland. And as we're doing that, you might notice that as we sort of tumble around the model, that we're painting these specular highlights are getting brighter and brighter. And maybe we want the ureter to also be kind of nice and specular. So if we're painting this area with white, you can see that the specular highlights are getting brighter. Well, how do I know that I haven't missed any areas? Because it's not just where the highlights are. We want the whole area to be that way. Well, in the same way that we looked at the mask, we can go under the kidney speck and we can say solo as diffuse. And as soon as we've done solo as diffuse, now we can see the specular texture as a grayscale map applied to it. Okay? So now we can see the areas that we're actually painting with lighter values. So that's maybe a more clear way to actually make sure that you're painting what you think you're painting. That's a good question. Because it's a 3D model, the specular highlights are going to be dependent on where your lighting is set up and where your model is set up. So we're not actually painting specular highlights. We're going to be leaving that to the renderer to determine where the specular highlights are going to be. So we're not painting light information. We're just painting how the model is going to react to light. So for example, when we're painting this adrenal gland, anything that's the same sort of substance or tissue, we'll paint this all the same value. And I'll just do this real quick. When we paint this all the same value, now when a light is shone on it, it's going to appear nice and specular. Whereas when a light is shone on the kidney surface at large, it's going to appear less shiny. So we can see that when we go right click and do unsolo. Now as we kind of tumble around this, you can see that the specular highlights are really popping off the adrenal gland, and they're a little bit more muted on the kidney itself. I think we'll call this done. And so we've got a specular channel and a diffuse channel. So now that we're done this, we want to make sure that we can export these textures for use in Maya. So that's a pretty simple process. We just go File, Export All Paint Layers. And at the very top, we can say Export Paint Layers for all models. Well, we just kind of want the active model. I mean, there's nothing else in our scene, but we could choose that as what we're exporting the paint layers for. And we have a few choices to make. Do we want all of these layers to be exported as individual textures, or do we want to collapse them down? Well, I kind of just want to collapse them down. I just want one texture for all the diffuse information and one texture for the specular map. So I'm going to say merge all channels. Yep. And so now you can see that we've got one file for the diffuse and one file for the specular. Now this looks like a kind of a cryptic naming thing. Well, what this means is you're going to have a prefix when it exports the file, and we can choose where it's going to do that. We'll just click on the folder icon and navigate to our textures folder. We'll just choose the folder that's going to write to. The channel name template, well, I don't really want the name channel or the word channel in my texture, so I'm just going to call this kidney, because that's what it is. So I'm going to call it kidney. And then $M, that's going to be, I think, the material name. And so this would have the name of default shiny, I think. And we don't really want that because we're not exporting the material name, so we can just delete that. So all we just want is the channel name. $C would be the channel name. So this is going to export two images, one called kidney_diffuse and one called kidney_specular. And we could override the names there if we wanted to. I'll just click override all names here so that it actually respects that in the individual textures. And we'll hit export. And this is going to go through and export all of that Ptex data. I can see I've got two files, one called kidney diffuse, which is 16 megabytes, and one called kidney specular, which is 2.1 megabytes. And if you try to open those up in anything, it's like you're not going to be able to see the data that's there. You're not going to be able to see any Photoshop is not going to read Ptex, at least not yet, as far as I'm aware. And so those are kind of hidden information, right? Like there's no application set to open that. But what we can do, I'll just jump into Maya, and I'm just going to create a new scene. And I'm going to import my kidney OBJ again. And of course it's going to come in massive because we scaled it up. So I'm going to scale this down to what I originally intended it to be, 0.01. Okay. And I'm going to apply a new material, a blend. And like we did with the leaf, this is a very simple process to link it all up. All we need to do is get the color attribute, click the checker icon, and choose File again. So we're putting a file texture into the color attribute for this kidney. And we're going to navigate to our diffuse Ptex file and click Open. And we're going to get a warning here. It's going to say Ptex texture files are only supported in Viewport 2.0 and third-party renderers that support Ptex. Basically, it's saying not everything you're going to come across is going to be able to render this file. But fortunately, if we hit 6 on the keyboard, we're going to get this really weird-looking thing. And that's because even though Viewport 2.0 says it can render Ptex textures, it kind of does a pretty bad job of it. But that's okay. We don't need to worry about what's showing up in the viewport. We only need to worry about what happens when we hit render. So the other thing, and it also automatically plugged it into transparency. And I suspect that's because we had an alpha channel in the Ptex. So I'm going to right-click on transparency and choose break connection. And I guess that's just something that we would have to do. Basically, when I loaded the file texture, it not only put the information into the color channel, but it also put information into the transparency channel. And I don't want transparency from that file. So I just right-clicked on it and went break connection to break the connection to that file. Okay, so this is starting to look a little better, but it still looks a little funny. But that's okay. It's going to look funny in the viewport, but when we render it out, it should look fine. All right, the other one that we wanted was a specular channel, so I'm going to choose the specular color, a file node, and then we'll grab our specular Ptex again. And you can see that that's the adrenal gland got a little bit more shiny. Let's see what renderer we've got set up here. So I'm going to choose Mental Ray, and I'm going to hit the render button. And if all goes well, then we get a nice kidney texture with blood vessels and everything. And we haven't talked about lighting or anything, so this is looking a little bit boring and uninteresting. And we haven't talked about linear workflow, which is why the textures look kind of washed out when compared to our original. This is looking a lot more richer and darker. And so I think next week, maybe in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about linear workflow and how to make sure our textures have the right color space. So, but for now, that's just kind of the basic way. Although I can't help but, for future reference, if you're ever revisiting this material, or for those people that are watching on YouTube, in order to, I don't think the color, I don't think the color management settings in Maya work with Ptex. At least they don't seem to be working. So what I need to do is put a gamma correct node in between the diffuse texture, and I'm going to set the gamma to 0.454. And this is what you used to have to do all the time in Maya, but now they've got a brand new color management system, which is much, much better and much easier to work with, but for some reason the Ptex doesn't seem to like that. So I've changed the gamma, and now the texture looks the same as like we had it in Mudbox. So that's just the weird gamma correct trick that seems to be required when working with Ptex. Okay, so that's Ptex painting in Mudbox.